Chapter 23, Square Candies That Look Round. Everybody stopped and crowded to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so that he could get a better view and looking in. Charlie saw a long table, and on the table were rows and rows of small, white, square-shaped candies. The candies looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each of them had funny little pink face painted on one side. At the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on the candies. "There you are," cried Mr. Wonka. "Square candies that look round." "They don't look round to me," said Mike Teavee. "They look square," said Veruca Salt. "They look completely square." "But they are square," said Mr. Wonka. "I never said they weren't." "You said they were round," said Veruca Salt. "I never said anything of the sort," said Mr. Wonka. "I said they looked round." "But they don't look round," said Veruca Salt. "They look square." "They look round," insisted Mr. Wonka. "They most certainly do not look round," cried Veruca Salt. "Veruca, darling," said Mrs. Salt, "pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you." "My dear old fish," said Mr. Wonka, "go and boil your head. How dare you speak to me like that?" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Oh, do shut up," said Mr. Wonka. "Now, watch this." He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door and flung it open. And suddenly, at the sound of the door opening, all the rows and rows of little square candies quickly looked round to see who was coming in. The tiny faces actually turned towards the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. "There you are," he cried triumphantly. "They're looking round. There's no argument about it. They are square candies that look round." "By golly, he's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Come on," said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. "On we go. We mustn't dawdle." "Butterscotch and butter gin," it said on the next door they passed. "Now that sounds a bit more interesting," said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. "Glorious stuff," said Mr. Wonka. "The Oompa Loompas all adore it. It makes them tidily. Listen, you can hear them in there now, whooping it up." Shrieks of laughter and snatches of singing could be heard coming through the closed door. "They're drunk as lords," said Mr. Wonka. "They're drinking butterscotch and soda. They like the best of all. Butter gin and tonic is also very popular. Follow me, please. We really mustn't keep stopping like this." He turned left, he turned right. They came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The three children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. Teavee, the only women now left in the party, were getting very out of breath. Mrs. Salt was a great fat creature with short legs, and she was blowing like a rhinoceros. "This way," cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. "Go slower," panted Mrs. Salt. "Impossible," said Mr. Wonka. "We should never get there in time if I did." "Get where?" asked Veruca Salt. "Never you mind," said Mr. Wonka. "You just wait and see." Chapter 24, Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. "The Nut Room," it said on the door next door that they came to. "All right," said Mr. Wonka. "Stop here for a moment, catch your breath, and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go in the Nut Room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels." Everyone crowded around the door. "Oh, look, Grandpa, look!" cried Charlie. "Squirrels!" shouted Veruca Salt. "Jeepers!" said Mike Teavee. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. "These squirrels are especially trained for getting the nuts out of the walnuts," Mr. Wonka explained. "Why use squirrels?" Mike Teavee asked. "Why not use Oompa Loompas?" "Because," said Mr. Wonka, "Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of walnut shells every time. It's extremely difficult, but in my factory I insist upon using only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful? The the way they get those nuts out, and see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's not a bad one? If it's a bad one, it makes a hollow sound and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There. Look, watch that squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one. They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. "Hey, Mummy," shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. "I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels." "Don't be silly, sweetheart," said Mrs. Salt. "Those all belong to Mr. Wonka." "I don't care about that," shouted Veruca. "I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel." "All right, my pet," Mrs. Salt said soothingly. Mummy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can." "But I don't want any squirrel," Veruca shouted. "I want a trained squirrel." At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. "Very well, Wonka," he said, importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. "How much do you want for one of these crazy squirrels? Name your price." "They're not for sale," Mr. Wonka answered. "She can't have one." "Who says she can't?" shouted Veruca. "I'm going to grab me a squirrel this very minute." "Don't," said Mr. Wonka quickly. But he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small, black, beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table.